Good thing there was mulch there.
I don't know. That's also why I always keep my phone in a shockproof case.
Yeah, that's probably it.
So I'm going to start with talk about some stuff about the episode itself. I can think of a couple of things that I want to say. I want to say something. We definitely want to talk about the well, I think that in terms of like informed commentary, it's probably good to give a little clarification about Peacemaker. I want to. There's a point that I want to make using the verbiage prophet Taylor as a data point.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk a little bit about the ethics, maybe, of sidelining Brenda's story. Especially as that like dovetails with other choices they made about how to tell the story, and whether it's her story or not.
Did you want to?
What's that?
We're good to go.
Yeah.
Yep. And
Do you
then
want to bring up the interview with her sister?
Yeah, I think we should mention that. We don't have to. You know, spend too much time on it. We should mention it so that people can go and read it or whatever. And then I like the idea of pivoting to starting to discuss things about like motivation versus rationalization and some of what we think we know about how certain parts of human cognition evolve. We want to make sure people know we're steering clear of heavily speculative evolutionary psychology and stuff like that. But when we get into that side of the discussion, I think the two things that I want to talk about most are mental mapping and pattern recognition.
Okay.
And then you can parlay that really well into the HAD model. All of it, I think we also made clear that what we're not describing is how religion evolved. In a certain sense, what we're describing is how something like the capacity for it evolved, but that doesn't make that's not a claim about where it comes from. We have to have certain cognitive abilities in place. I mean, you can't have it without language. You can't, got to have certain things, and you can't have it without theory of mind. You can't have it without the capacity to lie. Actually, you can't have it without a distinction between factual and non-factual belief. So, and then that we don't have to get very far. We can sort of limit what we're talking about to just kind of like certain, almost like cognitive dispositions that we have, without just trying to do big picture stuff on religion yet.
Yeah.
It lays a foundation for doing that.
Yeah, I think the main point here is about the difference between what are motivations and what are rationalizations, and how that functions.
And the way we'll pivot to that is I'll bring up the story depicting a lot of characters being in transition. I mean, we're in the middle of the series, a lot of characters in transitional spaces.
Yeah.
And that's a storytelling flaw that most cinema, egregiously reproduces all the time, is the idea that like what drives it is an ideological shift and sort of like motivated intentionality. You're visible on that screen even though you're not visible, right? Okay.
Yep.
Sure. Weren't blocking you out.
No.
I think after if we end up pivoting back to the show, maybe the best way to do it is just to say, okay, look, like we've talked about this before, but even if there are things that the show's getting wrong in terms of accuracy, like what kind of mirror still is it holding up? Like what is it helping us to see more clearly? And what kinds of questions should we be actually engaging rather than using the technical inaccuracies as a pretext for not engaging?
Yeah.
And that's a good way to bring audience involvement into it. What are we at? 5 after 4? 5?
Yeah, we got 5.
You want to get cracking? Or you want to wait 2 more minutes? I think we can just get cracking here.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to get going for the night. Dan and I have a bit of we usually have something like a roadmap of some of what we want to get to in the discussion. We're discussing episode 4 for clarification. We haven't seen past episode 4, like I assume most of you have, and I don't know if Hannah's going to join us. I think she's seen more of it, but we'll see if she shows up. It's an interesting episode, a largely Brenda-free episode, which we'll probably discuss a little more in a few moments. It definitely advances certain arcs in terms of certain plot arcs, develops some of the key characters, and there's definitely fodder for. Well, there's a lot of fodder for online debate, so fodder for discussion. A couple of things I wanted to. I want to start with an example. Take a very specific example out of here that for me illustrates a point that I keep wanting to kind of come back to in the show. That increasingly it's looking to me, watching online discussions and online debates, like this is a harder point to make. Let me explain to you what I mean. So I'm watching a lot of debates where you essentially have a whole bunch of people getting caught up on the question of the sort of like the accuracy or of the dialogue, right? Like, do Mormons talk like this? Okay. Yeah, Mormons talk weird. Mormons do say Heavenly Father a lot. Do they say Heavenly Father a lot like this? And it's weird the degree to which like there's really aggressive back and forth on this in online discussions, and how it seems like really not a coincidence how like the split in the discussion is ideological too. So it's like, and I think that the reason for that is I think that I'm just not gonna I'm not gonna pull punches here, but I'm also like gonna qualify what I'm saying. Mormons don't talk like this. And I've already spent a fair amount of time up here saying it's okay that Mormons don't talk like this, because making these characters talk like stock characters rather than like Mormons actually makes them more legible to a wider audience and communicates the things that you still want to communicate about Mormons. And I do think that people who are less interested in they would probably frame it as letting Dustin Lance Black lecture them about the dark side of Mormonism or something like that, but sort of less interested in engaging like the heavy questions that the series is trying to probe us to engage, right? Deep questions about our history, about honesty and transparency about history, about violence, about fundamentalism and literalism, and certitude, and adoration of authority figures, and priesthood and patriarchy, and all this stuff, right? It wants us to look at this stuff. And I think that, again, like the lack of accuracy, just in terms of like superficial ethnography almost. I think people use that as a pretext for just dismissing it out of hand and not engaging it. And then the weird thing is that there's sort of like a major minor premise there. It's like I don't have to listen to or pay attention to or take seriously the big picture stuff because the details are inaccurate. And it seems like it's generating a pushback, not of the form of saying you should pay attention to those things even if the details are inaccurate, and instead a weird kind of pushback saying, no, actually the details are accurate. Mormons do talk this way, right? So like I saw an example of this today, and it revolved around the question of whether Mormons refer to prophets with the word prophet and the last name. Right? He hears the John Taylor quote and he says, "Prophet Taylor." I know that. Okay? Mormons do not do that. They don't. They never have. I'm not saying that there are no Mormons alive that have ever uttered that phrase, and I'm not saying that there are no traditions outside of mainline Mormonism that might speak in that kind of parlance, although outside of mainline Mormonism, they probably, I don't know how many of them even have prophet figures that are, venerated like the president of the LDS Church. But Mormons don't say Prophet McKay, and they don't say Prophet Taylor, and they don't say Prophet Smith, and they don't say Prophet Young, and they don't say Prophet Nelson. They don't. Even actually calling the president of the church the prophet as opposed to calling Joseph Smith the prophet is a fairly recent innovation that really only goes back to about the McKay presidency. They say the prophet, or they say the prophet's name, and if it's a recent prophet, it includes an initial, because that's part of the way you do it, right? Or they say president. They say President McKay, or they say David O. McKay. But they don't say Prophet McKay. Okay? So there's this heated online discussion about whether or not this is how Mormons talk. And my thing is like, no, Mormons don't talk like that. Yes, it was actually a smart piece of writing, because it conveys in 2 words what you don't need any exposition to know what he means if you're an outsider. If he says President Taylor, it doesn't make the same kind of sense. If he just says John Taylor, you don't know that the guy whose scary quote he just heard was in fact an LDS prophet. So calling him Prophet Taylor is actually the perfect way of scripting it, even though Mormons don't talk that way. But I can't get over the fact that it's like defensive Mormons saying we don't talk that way, and then kind of like defensive fans of the series saying, yes, we do. Oh, we do. We totally do. You can't say we don't talk. I've heard people talk that way. Okay. There are degrees of variability and variety in terms of just like ethnographic patterns across a community. Not everybody talks the same way. Okay. But some of those patterns are really strong and really persistent, and there are things that the characters are doing that Mormons don't do. And I'm saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that this is an excuse for us to not take the series seriously. I'm saying let's look at why it's actually happening and what's actually being conveyed. And what's actually being conveyed there is a familiarity with the words of living and deceased prophets, and a reverence for prophets, and a commitment to addressing them by their title, even if it's not the way we do address them by their title, it shows us addressing them. You know what I'm saying? Like, it communicates what's tended to communicate to outsiders. It's the correct way to have the character say it, even though it's not the way Mormons say it. And it's okay.
So I was streaming it last week, and I heard your take on this, and I really appreciated it. And I thought, yeah, that's really interesting. You know, maybe it wouldn't be digestible to a general audience.
You'd have to do like 30 seconds more dialogue to make sense out of him saying President Taylor.
Maybe.
Even though it's accurate technically,
Maybe.
it would waste time.
But you mentioned a specific film, which is a really good film that I like, Doubt.
Yeah.
And whether or not, you know...
And I don't know. I'm not, yeah.
Well, I did some research into it. And essentially everything I could find was that, one, it was extremely accurate. And two...
and it's probably a Catholic playwright originally,
it is an ex-Catholic playwright.
Yeah.
And two, that Catholics, by and large, were able to access it and kind of wrestle with it and the points that it brought up because it was so accurate and to the point. And so, while I appreciate it, I feel like it's a really good take that you're making. I'm not sure I completely agree. I do think
that it's useful.
Yeah, I do think there are probably ways to demonstrate or access or even show that there's a shorthand of stuff that the audience won't pick up. The reason I say this, my background's in film. I write and direct. I even think it may have served the narrative a little bit better to make these characters more accessible because, like, for example, and I don't want to spend too much time
No, fine,
or
you're
anything,
fine.
but an easy example are all the uses of Heavenly Father, and everybody's
Right.
kind of getting hung up on that, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that you need to reiterate Heavenly Father and kind of as a switcheroo of terms of God or Lord or whatever
Right.
so many times to the point where it kind of paints the group or the characters as other from the very beginning. Whereas narratively, it's like, wouldn't you want to show these characters as a little bit more relatable to enhance the horror of what's coming down the line? And so, as I've kind of gone through with a fine-tooth comb on these, I feel like there is a way to write this dialogue that is not quite.
To be
so,
clear, I think on the one hand, I think it's defensible to try to come up with sort of like Mormon adjacent.
Yeah. Yeah,
particularities that are a little more resonate a little more legible to outsiders, but some of it is also just like actually bad.
Yeah.
Like some of the Heavenly Father stuff in particular, I think is quite cringy.
Yeah, the Prophet Taylor thing, to me was more. I mean, it was like, yeah, that's not right, but it was more forgivable than some of the moments that feel like commentary almost.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I wonder if it's fair. The argument that's happening is fair in that if you're going to lecture a religion or a group and try to teach them a lesson on something, the devil is in the details. You know, the details are important. It would be like getting well, I don't want to get to 1-to-1 ratio, but like think of any other religion and try
or an ethnic group.
Right, or an ethnic group, and not getting things like the vernacular or the culture or the custom correct, even if there was a lot of research.
Yeah, I mean there are
Anyway.
times that it sounds a little bit like a white writer trying to write African American vernacular English.
That's a good comparison.
But
so, anyway, that's my thought.
But what I'll say, what I will concede is, I do think that if it were more technically accurate and engage in more kind of like subtle forms of accuracy, that Mormons would be probably more inclined to have a come to Jesus moment with ourselves about the content. And I know that is something that is a priority to the filmmakers here, but it's not the top priority.
Right.
And it does have to be balanced against just having people watch it and having lots of people watch it.
That's actually the part of it I think could have been. Anyway, who knows?
We had another comment.
It kind of does seem to be his priority. He talks about it a lot.
Yeah, but I don't think I don't think it's a higher priority than selling the series in the first place,
Well,
and distributing it and getting it to a wide audience. Because if he gets it to a wide audience, like they're putting forward a couple of the actors for Emmy consideration and stuff like that. Like they really want to make a big splash with this. If this was a sort of an inside job, so to speak, if this was Mormons talking to Mormons about things we need to be talking about,
Yeah.
it would be different. And in that case, I think that you'd have a really, really, really strong, not even moral obligation, but just like practical obligation, if you want it to be effective, to like really not screw some of these things up.
Sure. I do, so this last weekend, in between coming here the last couple times, had a family gathering.
Mhm.
My mother she's a second wave feminist, PhD,
Mhm.
was raising, I was 14 when this event happened. I'm the oldest kid to kind of put my family in there. So growing up, she was a woman who was well aware
Mhm.
of misogynistic tendencies inside the church, right?
Yeah.
And she's talked about that a little bit. My brother-in-law is from Payson. He has family that married into this Lafferty family, not this particular one.
Right, but the extended family. Yeah.
You know, and each of them, while not necessarily as interested in all things Mormon as I am, they're turned off by it. They can't comprehend the show. They can't get into the show.
Yeah, they just can't make sense out of it.
Because of it.
I think it's going to be really, really hard for devout rank and file Mormons to get into. It just
My family's
it
not devout. We're academics. My dad's a psychologist. My mother's in
Yeah.
education, that has a lot of education. So they have some tendencies to allow for some of this, but even for them, it
just takes you out of it a little
It
bit,
takes you out.
and I don't think it takes outsiders out of it at all. Is my point. Like I keep thinking every time I see a character like Dan's going to talk about this in a minute, but like there's a weird kind of sinister creepiness to like the patriarchal figures that is really over the top in some cases, and I see that I'm just like that just doesn't seem like, yeah, like Mormons can be creepy, and Mormon, like the way that patriarchal men can, subtly exercise real authority in a moment, right? But it's like, but then I'm like, they don't go and try to like appeal to their stake calling to get somebody out of jail. Good Lord, I mean, good heavenly Father, or yeah, like release them into my custody. But then I'm like, okay, but imagine that this scene is in True Detective and it's like the Reverend Billy Lee Tuttle doing the same thing, and then I'm like, and I imagine watching that, and I imagine thinking like that wouldn't I wouldn't feel defensiveness. I wouldn't feel like that's not the way that would be. It's just like it just would enhance the drama for me.
That's the part I need to chew on a little, because I've seen, to my earlier point, I've seen examples where they do get it right, and you can still access the drama and the narrative and still get everything right. So.
But yeah. So, there are some other things that we want to talk about with the episode too, and you had mentioned patriarch. I know we should also probably, as scholars, engage in a little bit of clarity around the Mormon pamphlets.
Well, you want me to start from the?
I would say
still doing
I would say talk a little bit more about some of the episode
Okay.
response, and then we'll shift into
Yeah.
the more abstract.
And I know we had a couple of
I'll
comments.
pivot you to your awesome thing here.
We had a couple of comments I wanted to get to first. Is
I
it
guess
the time
we-
passed or?
Well, I mean, just based off of the comments about whether or not the speech and dialogue is authentic, like for me as sort of an outsider, it seems more like for me, it doesn't disconnect as much.
Yeah,
And
I don't imagine it
and
does.
For me, like my rationalization is maybe because it's a period piece. Maybe back then in the '80s, they kind of talked maybe a little bit more like that. Maybe things were a little bit more heavy-handed back then.
It's old-fashioned. It's rural. Like
So-
there are speech markers for this, and
Of course, today, modernly, it's not as
yeah.
that.
But these are sort of the stock characters that they're reaching for. In addition to trying to make them authentic Mormons, they're also just trying to make them into, anti-government, old-fashioned, right-wing, religious zealots. And there's just kind of like a stock language for that, and you have to intersperse that stock language with Mormonese, and it's probably some of the time it's probably going to ring really strange to Mormon ears.
Okay, we had two.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, like, actually, I kind of think that the two goals of, like, making it legible to outsiders and also talking to Mormons, I think they go hand in hand, because I kind of think Mormons wouldn't take this seriously if it were just Mormons talking to Mormons. If it were just an ex-Mormon saying, hey, Mormons, here's what I think, they'd be like, all right, cool, whatever, yeah, we've heard this. But since it's like, hey, outsiders, look what Mormons are doing, I think that actually is making members of the church take it more seriously. So I think that's working.
Yeah, it's sort of a circuitous route, though. It provokes defensiveness by provoking questions from outsiders rather than saying, this is a mirror of who you are. What do you think of the mirror you're looking at?
So they just ignore that.
They just ignore that, but then when outsiders say, like, okay, well, like, what about this? Then
You have to think a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the flip side is I will say that, like, I'm not positive that this is true, but I strongly suspect that Brigham City is not as dramatically awesome to outsiders as it is to insiders. And I'm not saying that as a knock against the film, because, like, that's who he made it for, and so like it's scripted so that all the subtleties will resonate exactly with an LDS audience, and I think a lot would go over the heads of outsiders, and it wouldn't have nearly the dramatic effect, especially a few really pivotal emotional moments in that film.
All right, we have one more.
One last, sorry. I'm thinking, you know, if I was still back in Kansas City and I was sitting around a water cooler with people at work, what would the discussion be? What would the conversation be with people who knew I'm a member of the church? And I think it would be a lot of it would be, yeah, we don't talk like, yeah, we don't, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, that's me, because I lived in that time.
You just sort of
So
get stuck on it.
maybe somebody who's 25.
It's far enough
Whatever it is.
removed or whatever that you don't get
Yeah,
stuck on it
and
as much.
I wonder if it just didn't do what it's supposed to do.
One more comment, and then we'll.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just kind of with what they were saying, I think just as a really highly misrepresented religion, like we've had, I mean, definitely.
We're oversensitive to this stuff for sure.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think, like, for me personally, there's been enough change over the years, but, like, versus how they're talking in the show in the 80s, people are like, oh, we don't say that. I'm like, yeah, but we did. And also, people are just taking it really personally. Like, I had a much different experience. Like, I grew up in South Carolina. Like, people don't know anything about Mormons. People ask me how many moms I had all the time.
Yeah.
And so just all of this, people might be extra sensitive, like you're saying.
We're very
because-
sensitive to how we're perceived by the
Right.
outside, which is something that this episode actually takes up internally, in a weird way. I think an exactly backward way. But we'll table that for a second, because I think Dan wants to.
He mentioned earlier this is right in the middle of the series. We get a lot of transitions. We get what we thought was kind of an awkward plot twist that wasn't executed phenomenally well. We get Brenda.
The whole, like, oh, he really was mad at Dan thing.
Yeah,
Which was supposed to be some, like, weighty reveal that changes the whole, you know, didn't quite land.
Yeah, it didn't land like they tried to make it seem like it would. Brenda kind of steps to the side, is only in it for a bit in connection with the letter, and I also thought there was a bit of a pivot toward what seems to be based on the quote from Black that I read last week about what he thought the thesis of his show was about fundamentalist texts. We finally get the introduction of at least one of these texts and a quotation from the other. So there's the quotation from President Taylor's 1886. I don't know. Quasi-revelation.
Yeah.
I don't know what the thinking is these days on it. But the other one was.
I think the thinking is somewhere between he probably wrote it and probably it still shouldn't be counted as a revelation.
Yeah, it was obviously just.
I don't think it's a fabrication.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that John Taylor Jr., you know, a decade or so later, when he was being, there was a church court because he was promoting polygamy.
Mm.
He was very, 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 very popular. He was sort of the people's apostle, and he and I think Matthias Cowley were brought in, like, with other apostles to, like, you know, have their membership checked or whatever. And I think there were two different times that it occurred, and the first time they were just removed from the quorum, and then the second time they were actually stripped of their priesthood and excommunicated. But I know that during one of those, there are notes of these councils, and I know that during one of them he actually sort of admitted into evidence the revelation, and that nobody present challenged its authenticity as something that his father had written.
Oh, interesting.
I think it was in the first trial. The other thing interesting about Taylor is that after his excommunication, and you have especially the Lauren Woolley's, who we get this from, right? He was part of the Taylor security detail, and he's the sort of transmission vector for the revelation. And by the 20s, they've got a fundamentalist movement emerging, and they tried really hard to get John Taylor Jr. to join him, and he never did. He didn't want to be a part of any of it.
I think the main text for this episode was this pamphlet, The Peacemaker, which kind of glosses over it very quickly, printed by Joseph Smith, which is really his office printed it. I think it's debated whether or not he knew anything about it. He released a note or something in his newspaper immediately after it was released, saying he had no knowledge of it and wouldn't have allowed it to be printed if he did. But other folks argue this was it was written by someone who wasn't even a member of the church, advocating for
a Jewish guy.
Yeah. And so some people think that this was his attempt to send out some feelers, and somebody else's, having an agent do it for him, so that he had plausible deniability. But I think a lot of folks don't see Joseph Smith's hand in the writing, at least. But that's something that's
It doesn't read to me very much like D&C 132 does. And the thing is, D&C 132 is every bit as damning a text as this is. I think the reason that it's in the show is that it's like the Laffertys actually did dig it up and venerate it as a text. Like it really was, I mean, it's weird to sort of ascribe it to Joseph Smith, to sort of slide it in there like that. But if you want to ascribe anything, damaging to Joseph Smith around polygamy, there's a ton of stuff right there in the D&C. You don't need an obscure pamphlet. Yeah,
and then we also have the presentation of D&C 132 with him and Emma Smith, Emma confronting him in their.
And there are definitely rumors that she burned a copy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there were rumors at the time that she burned a copy. I don't know if she burned it in front of him or if she burned it when Hiram gave it to her. And I don't know if she actually did or if it was, but the rumor was that I think the first time she saw it, she threw it in the fire.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, but I thought it was.
So much of Nauvoo is like, we don't know what was happening, we just know what the rumors were.
Yeah.
Right? We know there were rumors that this, we know that there were rumors that, because so much of what, Joseph goes to a certain degree of, I would say he goes to great lengths to not produce very much of a direct textual record of anything he's doing in Nauvoo. And he recedes behind these sources, these scribes, these people following around, taking notes on what he's saying, but producing almost no texts of his own, including D&C 132, which gets published in Nauvoo, but which he claims even at the time goes back much further than that.
Is it true that 132 replaced a different section of the Doctrine and Covenants that talked about marriage between a man and a woman, and he wrote that?
I think that's attributed to Oliver Cowdery, and that showed up in the Kirtland period. And I don't know if it was actually a section of the D&C or the Book of Commandments.
Joe Smith had gone to Toronto, right? While he was out of the country, the church had adopted it.
Yeah, and it was in part because I think that Cowdery had at least some sense that, I mean, he knew about Fanny Alger at that point, I think. And actually, from what I understand, the timing of Fanny Alger is still a little bit up in the air. And I think that I remember hearing recently that Don Bradley is going to be doing a presentation at MHA called Dating Fanny Alger, in which he presents some pretty definitive evidence for the timeline. But I don't know what that evidence is going to be. In any case, Cowdery was aware of accusations. He was aware of the affair, as he called it. And so it could have been, again, like a kind of a PR thing, like wanting to put a public face. It could also be that he wanted to undermine anything Joseph was trying to do in that regard and kind of get out in front of it, that he was against it. But I don't know if it was ever like officially canonized, but there was definitely a statement on marriage in Kirtland.
I think one of the interesting things that the pamphlet does is plays a role as kind of the instigator, motivator, inspiration for what the Laffertys are going to move into, that this text is responsible for this. And that came through pretty strongly for me and kind of got my hackles up because I've spent a lot of time being very frustrated with the notion of scriptural literalism, which is something that a lot of the folks who made a lot of money and got a lot of attention and gained a lot of power in the early 2000s in response to 9/11 talked about scriptural literalism as one of the, this cancer, this main inspiration for what these folks are doing, which conflicts just wildly with all of the data on the role of ideology, the role of text, the role of religion in religious violence and other kinds of activities, ritual, all different kinds of things. So
This to me is related, and I know you're going to get us into kind of the weeds on this in a second, but I want to help frame it a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because for me, this is related to a problem that I see both as a social scientist, but also as a huge fan of cinema, of film, which is that I think this is one of the things that our sort of cinematic language, our way of depicting characters, making decisions, and undergoing character arcs, it gets really, really, really wrong. And that's that but it makes sense that we do this because we also want to see ourselves in the same light. We really want to believe that we undergo significant transitions in our lives and make life-altering changes to how we live. Because we are motivated to do so. Like something ideologically, an idea, like we make a decision to do it, and we do it because we decided to do it, because we had a reason to do it. And so much of the data that we have coming out of so many disciplines indicates almost the opposite. That we find ourselves, that these transitions that we undergo, it could be converting to a religion, it could be renouncing a religion, it could be getting married, it could be making a career change, it could be making a change in what you study, all kinds of really significant things that we do in our lives, and that usually these are things that happen to us, and then we, after the fact, try to make sense out of them. Or
Yep.
These are things that we choose to do for reasons that have almost nothing to do with ideology or text or rationalizations, that are motivated that have to do with just like social relationships and social forces. And we're just, as human beings, we are not very good at understanding why we do the things we do, but we are very good at explaining to ourselves why we did them after the fact.
And we like to believe that our circumstances are a product of our actions and our behaviors, and that we have some kind of control over them. And we like to believe that our behaviors and our actions are a direct product of our worldview and our beliefs and things like that, which is also rarely the case. More often than not, our beliefs come in after the fact as a way to rationalize, defend, explain, legitimize, make sense out of our behaviors, which come from a more deeply rooted space. And so I want to talk a little bit about something that I've addressed a handful of times on different social media, the difference between our intuitive cognition and our reflective cognition. and how these things interact and how they influence our behavior. And whenever I talk about this, I always start with a simple illustration of the difference between reflective and intuitive cognition. And so this is the illustration that I use, and hopefully that shows up in the camera. But what do you see?
Gray and white.
See two different colors, or two different shades of gray, objects. But if you take your finger and hold it over the seam in the middle, they're actually the exact same color gray.
What? Yeah.
And this is an optical, what's that?
It didn't,
But
It didn't do it?
I don't think it, no, it looked.
Hold your finger up in front of your eyes so that
Oh,
you're
okay.
covering up the,
The seam.
The bottom one's still lighter than the
okay,
top.
how about now? Is it a little more?
Well, it
So-
still looks lighter at the bottom, and they both look gray.
Oh my
It
God!
doesn't
No,
look white.
if you
What?
do it around.
Yeah, so I'm going to explain why, one, why this happens, but two, why it doesn't work the same way for everybody.
Okay.
So what this image does is it tricks your brain into thinking it's looking at a three-dimensional object in space. And it sees a horizon line, it sees a sky, it sees a shadow telling you that the light source is coming from up here. And so when it sees two colors that are the exact same shade, it doesn't make sense. Wait, this is in the light. This has got to be lighter. This is in a shadow. This has got to be darker. But they're the exact same shade of gray. And so your brain is saying, okay, well, you're going to perceive them as two different shades of gray. So that there's a reason that they look the exact same, even though one's in the light and one is in a shadow. And what this illustrates, and most optical illusions to some degree or another are exploiting some kind of cognitive,
Like shortcut.
default setting shortcut and kind of showing you where it is. And what this shows you is that,
Your brain's doing an awful lot of work
yeah,
just making visual sense out of it. Like it's imposing all kinds of order. If you could somehow shut off all of your filters, you wouldn't be able to make visual sense out of the world.
yeah, nothing would make sense. It would just be data. But our mind construes and organizes the data for us so that we can make sense out of the world.
Before we can even consciously reflect on it in the least.
Yeah.
Or try to make sense out of it on an abstract level.
Just our ability to distinguish ourselves from the environment around us is something that only works because our brain constructs it. So we don't perceive the world as it is. We perceive what our brain, our minds give us, basically, what they construct. And there's there was a TED talk, I think, about a woman who had a stroke. And she was a neuroscientist. And as soon as she realized what was going on, she was like, oh, I got to remember all this. And, but she noticed that she could, I think she was looking at her hand, and it just kind of dissolved into everything around her. Like she could no longer distinguish herself from the environment. And it's a fascinating story, but all of our senses.
It's a very important cognitive function that was short-circuiting and
Yeah.
freaked her out and made her realize something bad was happening to her brain, and she was right.
All of our senses and all of our cognition is not ours. It's being mediated by our minds, and our minds have a bunch of architecture and default settings that help guide this, that were installed by evolution, for lack of a better word, and also by the universal experiences of being human. All infants have to count on other humans to survive. Humans are phenomenally important to us. And so
And it's not just our brains, it's our entire sensory apparatus. Like,
Yeah,
your
yeah.
eyes are doing tons of work before it even gets to your
Yeah.
your visual cortex.
cartoons only work because our brain fills in the gaps between the images to make it seem like this is actual
fluid motion.
yeah, something going on in space, because we need to be able to detect that. And so stick with me because it's going to take a minute, but all of us are different. We don't all pull the same evolutionary product off the shelf, and all of our experiences in infancy growing up are different. However, all of us get to experience what our minds give us. And the things that are more evolutionarily rooted are the things that are in control, whereas the things that we learn reflectively tend to be more ephemeral and don't tend to be in control as much. And some examples of this is where we get into reflective knowledge. So logic, reason, things where we can think things through. This is a different part of our brain. Well, I don't want to say different part of our brain, but a different cognition is operating here.
And it's very rarely in the driver's seat.
Right. And so there are a number of ways that our responses to situations are driven by what's going on intuitively that we have no control over and usually no knowledge of. For instance, when we feel, there are a bunch of different ways that we can either feel good or bad about something based on what our intuition is giving us, and then we're going to take that feeling and we're going to use our reflective cognition to try to rationalize it or defend it. And so,
Again, just
Latter-day
make
Saints-
sense out of it, yeah.
Latter-day Saints who see this and go, we don't clasp our hands in prayer, this is garbage, I'm not watching any more of it. What this is a way to say, I felt a little intuitive pinch based on this, and I'm going to find a reason to reject this as not valid. And
But you were already in a place where you weren't interested in this,
Right.
is the point here.
And so some of the most powerful intuitive cognitive forces we have are, one, our desire to stay alive, our desire to pass on our genes, and also our desire to curate and improve our social standing. So things that make us look bad within the social identities that are most important to us are going to give us that little intuitive pinch and are going to make us respond accordingly.
We also don't like feeling foolish or stupid, which means we love confirmation bias.
Right.
We just love it, more than popcorn.
So one of the issues I have with the notion of scriptural literalism, even constitutional literalism, that phrase, by the way, I wrote it down on some notes because I heard it last night talking about constitutional literalism.
They also use the phrase constitutional fundamentalism.
Yeah. Is that none of these behaviors are governed by the text. These are governed by people's intuitive desires to improve their standing, become sheriffs so we can control things, control my wife so that I don't get the raw end of the deal. I'm not subjugated to somebody that society thinks I should not be subjugated to.
Control my destiny, fulfill what I'm called to do. Feel important, feel spiritually powerful.
Those are the things that drive people. Texts come in secondarily as excuses, as rationalizations, as defenses. And we see this in anytime there's any kind of social identity that asserts a principle, somewhere in history there's going to be an example of them rejecting that principle, but also saying it's because of their social identity. And the example that springs easiest to mind is the notion that you should not have a president who engages in extramarital affairs. In the 90s, anybody in the GOP would have said flat out, absolutely not. Obviously, anyone engaging in extramarital affairs, they cannot be president. If they are lying to their wife,
The dignity of the office and
if they lie to their to their spouse, they will lie to the nation. They're not a worthy leader. Fast forward, look, we're not electing a pastor.
Yeah.
We're electing a leader. So the principles are not what's important. It's the interests of the group that are important, and the principles will be malleable, will adjust in order to serve the interests of the group. And Latter-day Saints do this kind of thing all the time because religious beliefs... Sorry, I got a popcorn kernel in my throat.
it's the worst.
So I'm saying religious beliefs as a shorthand, but I don't think that's a great descriptor. Ideologies might be a better way to say it. Are not rooted as much as in our intuition as they are in our desire to advance whatever causes are important to us. And they're not the same as factual beliefs. They don't come from the same part of our cognition. They are better described, and cognitive scientists will describe them more as credences.
Now, this is a really important distinction. I don't want us to gloss over this. There's an enormous cognitive difference between you saying, even if it's a controversial subject, like I believe that wearing masks helps prevent the spread of COVID or something like that, right? Like there's a range of possible belief positions on that sort of spectrum there that are possible. It is qualitatively different than saying I believe God doesn't exist, or I believe that God intervenes in the world, or I believe that even stuff like karma. Like it's not, you don't believe the one in the same place that you believe in the other. It's not the same. They're not the same kind of proposition that you're weighing the likelihood, the likeliness of. It's not just a difference in degree. It's a difference in kind.
So there's one paper I'll go to that I think summarizes the difference well. Factual beliefs, one, are practical setting independent. In other words, they're not situationally emergent. They're consistent. Two, cognitively govern other attitudes. In other words, we make decisions about behaviors and things like that based on factual beliefs. Three, they're evidentially vulnerable. That is, they can change when the evidence changes. By way of contrast, and this paper calls them religious credences, one, have perceived normative orientation. That is, they're associated with what a social group or social identity considers normative. Excuse me.
In other words, it's not just the way things are, it's the way things are supposed to be.
Right. Two, are susceptible to free elaboration. So, in one situation, philandering president bad. Another situation, philandering president perfectly fine. And three, are vulnerable to special authority. So we may not be able to change the beliefs, but somebody else can tell us the beliefs need to change. And so folks who try to reduce religious belief to delusion, I've seen this in some articles that have come out in the last few years, the notion that because it is reducible to magical thinking, the idea that certain behaviors can connect with certain outcomes where there is no demonstrated link between the two. They refer to that as magical thinking. There's an argument that has been made that religious beliefs are magical thinking. They do not correspond to reality. Therefore, they are delusion. Therefore, they are a mental deficiency. They are... There's even folks who argue it's brain damage, a mental disability, and that's smushing all these different kinds of cognition together to serve a rhetorical goal, to try to vilify, marginalize, pathologize religious belief, when it is a part of a much larger set of beliefs that absolutely every human on earth participates in.
We are capable of believing things that other people find outlandish in the realm of credence.
So
because we have minds, our capacity to do that is built on other cognitive capacities that we have that are essential to who we are.
And so when we get into texts don't govern anybody's intuitive cognition. Texts are there to be interpreted. I've said before, they have no inherent meaning. In fact, I'm getting in lots of arguments right now because of a TikTok video where I said that, I think like a week ago. This really upset a lot of people. But because they have no inherent meaning, everything that we bring to a text intuitively, reflectively, is going to help us create meaning. And whether we are aware of it or not, more often than not, the meanings we are going to create are going to serve whatever those goals and those interests and those rhetorical needs of ours are. So for a guy who has the government breathing down his neck, who has a wife that seems to be wanting to give him trouble, who has found a text that now says gives him an excuse for trying to hold authority over her, and basically he's going to jump at this opportunity to take this thing and run with it because it's going to serve his needs, his interests, and his insecurities. And so to say that it inspires things, to say that it has inherent meaning that is inherently dangerous, I think misconstrues what is going on with the relationship of religious belief to religious texts. And
Religious texts about murder don't motivate non-murderers to become murderers. They rationalize murder committed by people that are murderers.
And there are a number of different ways. Who was the fictional character who inspired John Lennon's murder? Holden Caulfield.
Holden Caulfield, yeah.
Yeah. Like, people
Catcher in the Rye.
people come up with excuses, explanations for why they're doing the things they're doing from all different kinds of places. But things like the Bible, not the Book of Mormon, but some of these other texts that are probably going to be brought up later in the series, are going to be held up as the inspiration a lot more than people are going to hold up other things that have been appealed to as inspiration for violence. And so this is one of my concerns with the way this series is treating these texts that it's finally getting to.
There are a couple of points I want to make with respect to this, like this link, this alleged link between like a text that valorizes a certain behavior and that directly, primarily motivating behavior. In part because we do this with way more than Scripture. We do this way outside of religion, and I think almost every, just as an example, almost every kind of left-leaning person in the country has had to hear over and over and over again from right-wing, family members or interlocutors or whatever about the violence of communism in the 20th century, and that the violence of the Cultural Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution or the Stalin terror, reign of terror, whatever, that these things are intrinsic to leftist thought and to leftist ideas, and that they're all ultimately that Marx is conjuring violence out of people by saying that he thinks that workers are going to rise up, right? That there's somehow like there's a kind of magic that the texts, like the ideas, like hypnotize people and cause them to go and be violent, and is like you've been imbibing left-wing ideas your whole life, and it's never made you feel like being violent. This is just an example, but like I think it's a little easier for again like left-leaning people who quite frankly, I think that we are more inclined to be critical of religion and to critical of traditional religions and patriarchal religions and things like that, and be more inclined to see that. But it's really easy to see how unfair it is when like somebody's even taking like very obvious patterns of violence and making them into the sort of like inescapable, inevitable expression of the underlying ideas and texts and values.
So what I hear you saying, well, obviously it's a lot, but if I were to condense it, it sounds like the way that the show is treating, for instance, like the Peacemaker pamphlet, is that as like a forerunner or inspiration, and what you're saying is that much more likely it's a justification.
It's a reverse engineering, yeah.
Right. But even having said that, shouldn't texts still be held accountable for the role that they play in justifying violence or misogyny or whatever?
I think the way they're represented in groups is
something that groups should take responsibility for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's no meaning without a reader. And so
if it became really common for Mormon leaders to use the story of Nephi as justification for killing drunk people, then that text would be problematic. Right? But it's not that the text is causing it. It's that the text is being mobilized and weaponized by a group to rhetorical ends. In this case, to violent rhetorical ends, right?
And I think
it's just not the way that we use that text.
And I think it's pretty complex, but there are a number of things that have been blamed for violence. Video games. In fact, I think just today or yesterday, somebody came out and said the Buffalo shooting was inspired by violent video games.
There's zero research that even vaguely supports that.
The research unilaterally undermines that conclusion. And so
really,
I think
in fact, one of the things that we know from trying to study violence and trying to understand violence is that very often when it comes to like really, I don't want to say spectacular, really dramatic kinds of violence, really dramatic scopes of violence, it's really hard to explain even why this act occurred, let alone reduce it to some. And again, we can see us doing it. We can see progressives doing this right now. Like the Kids Manifesto has replacement theory stuff in it, right? This is sort of like immigrants are replacing white people and diluting the culture, and whites are going to become a minority, kind of right-wing nationalistic talking point that you encounter fairly regularly in some Fox News spaces and with much more regularity in alt-right spaces online. And it's like, man, I get the appeal. Like, I want to blame Tucker Carlson too for it, but like.
And Tucker Carlson.
Oh yes, Tucker Carlson. Sorry, did I call him Carlton?
The two of them.
I want to blame both of them.
Thick as thieves they are.
I want to blame Tucker Carlson too, but like, that's not the explanation for why he did this. Like explanations are very, very complicated. And one of the things that, for me, one of the easiest ways to figure out if you have a problem with some kind of even like subtly sort of bigoted attitude toward any group is if you think that knowing that somebody belongs to that group by itself helps explain a lot about what they do, right? So like if somebody kills a bunch of people and then you find out like that person's Jewish, maybe you think to yourself, well, okay, but that doesn't tell me anything about why they killed him. Or maybe you think to yourself, oh, got it, I know everything I need to know. Okay, or maybe they're Muslim, right? Somebody commits an act of random violence against a group of people. Okay, well, a lot of the country, if they find out that the person's Muslim, are like, oh, I get it. I understand now, right? And that's, so like, very often it's just when we reach for totalizing explanations, like, oh, that's the only thing I need to know about the person. If I know that the person belongs to this group, that's the most important information that I can have about that person. And I can infer so much about that person just based on them belonging to this group. We all do this. We all do it.
And I think the texts play a role to the degree that they interact with the identity politics that are going on. A lot of research on suicide bombing has tried to figure out what the role of ideologies, religion, things like that are. And they find out with a lot of folks who have been stopped before, particularly in incidents of Muslim suicide bombings, or folks who have been recruited for Muslim suicide bombings or who have failed. They've done all kinds of interviews and frequently find out they're not really incredibly well informed about the texts, about the Quran, but are looking for...
Or super devout necessarily.
Yeah. Are looking for security for a family, are looking for some kind of glory in their community, are looking to...
are just really angry and
are really
secure.
angry, are lashing out because their community is being oppressed. I think you'll find that suicide bombing across the board tends to have more to do with a group being oppressed by an invading or occupying force than with religious ideology. In fact, the suicide vest was innovated by a group that was openly secular and social, leaning towards socialism, the Tamil Tigers.
Yeah.
And so when we try to blame the text, this is looking for, I think, an excuse. I think when texts are used to foment certain kinds of us versus them ideologies, outgroup conflict, that's when they can be weaponized. And there's a lot of rhetoric that we see in the church. I joined the church in 2000. Yeah, 2000 as an adult. I never, every time they want to sing primary songs, I'm like, I don't really know any primary songs. But I have heard people talk about growing up with this chewed gum and lit cupcake metaphor. And people have taken their own lives because of that metaphor, not because they that has power as much as it has power because of how it is weaponized within a community, that you now no longer feel value in relation to the people around you, that your value has been diminished or has been taken away. And so I think it has a lot to do with how we deploy them. Because if somebody's going to a text all on their own without the influence of any spiritual or religious leaders or any community or anything like that, they're going to get whatever they are looking for out of the text. And you really never see, except for maybe Holden Caulfield, you don't really see folks who go in and just, with nothing else pushing him in that direction, read something and say, oh, well, here I go killing, to badly quote Rick and Morty.
Yeah, like I have
Here I
no,
go
if I have no interest at all, like nothing, no other part of me, no other reason, no other inclination of any kind to be violent to drunk people, I am not going to read First Nephi and develop an urge to do that.
There's a lot more.
But if First Nephi gets weaponized by my community as a rationalization for violence toward drunkards, and I see the effects, I see it happen, I see it get rewarded, I see it get lionized and valorized in the community, right? I see the kinds of discussions that emerge when we're reading that section. I see the way it gets talked about in sacrament meeting talks and stuff like that, right? That is a problem with, that's a community in which violence toward drunkards is a problem. And that's a community in which I'm more likely to be susceptible to engaging in violence toward drunkards for whatever reason, because I want to feel like a real man, or I want to feel like a part of the community. I want approval. I want validation, right? But that's not because the text made anybody do anything.
There's I think if you look, you see there's a lot of prescribed violence in the Hebrew Bible.
There's tons of it.
There's I don't want to fall into the anti-Semitic trap of talking about the God of the Hebrew Bible over and against the God of the New Testament.
No.
Because there is more variation within the two volumes than between the two volumes in the way that deity is represented. But the folks whose only sacred text is the Hebrew Bible tend not to be phenomenally violent.
No, in fact,
and
they tend to mobilize scriptural text for thousands of years now. But certainly since the rise of Rabbinic Judaism, they tend to mobilize violent texts as cautionaries against violence in their communities. They tend to mobilize texts about even things like capital punishment, even things like killing sinners the way that a Levitical text describes it. They've found ways to actually use the text to bring about the cessation of killing people for committing crimes.
Brad, just to clarify, you haven't been listening to Ben Shapiro about that stuff, right?
What's that?
You're not getting that from Ben Shapiro?
I'm not getting that from Ben Shapiro, sorry.
No, I'm getting from Ben Shapiro that if my house is going to be underwater because of global warming, I just have to sell it,
Yeah.
and then I'll be in the clear.
So, part of the point that I wanted to make coming off of this, or, sort of elaborating on this discussion about the relationship of violent text to violent behaviors, even very popular, very prominent, very powerful violent text to violent behavior, is to not only show like how easy it is to treat the relationship between motivation or ideas and violence really, really, really reductively. And I think it can be easier for us to see that if we see it, the way that it gets applied to other communities or other groups. But I also want to kind of like do the reverse on religion. I talk to my students about this every class I teach, whether it's just like an intro to anthropology where we just do a unit on religion. It is very, 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 very difficult to say with anything even resembling scientific certitude that something causes something else, especially if the things we're talking about are remotely complicated. Okay? Smoking cigarettes causes cancer. Okay? Oncologists saw it intuitively recognized a link between that for decades before we started studying it. And it took us generations of studies built on studies, hundreds and thousands of studies. During the entire process, almost the only value that you got out of most of the studies was that they showed you how to make better studies, less problematic. They showed you how you look closely at the study that you design and you can see the design flaws and you can see that you fail to account for certain variables. And by the way, it's actually really easy to sort of pin down and specifically define the factors here, the A and the B, the A causing B, right? The difference between smoking cigarettes and not smoking cigarettes is pretty straightforward, and you can quantify it. And the difference between cancer and not cancer is also pretty straightforward, and you can quantify it across communities. So these are things that are easy to define, easy to measure, and therefore easy to isolate as variables, and then you can start building your studies. And then a generation or two later, you can actually say, not only are we certain that there's a link here, but we understand the mechanism of causality. And that's just something as gospel as smoking causes cancer, causes lung cancer. Religion causes violence. Is that a claim that it's even possible to design a study to falsify? Can you give me a definition of religion that I can then quantify and put in my study? Can you give me a definition? I'm not even saying that religion causes violence, religion causes conflict, religion causes abuse, religion causes warfare, whatever. I'm not even saying that those statements are true or false. I'm saying they're not, that they're wildly unscientific. A scientific claim is a testable claim and it's a falsifiable claim. It's a claim where you can define terms. But I'm willing to go in this sort of defense against the accusation that religion causes people to do bad stuff. I'm also willing to go the other direction. Say this. In the end, I can't even as a scholar of religion, even as a social scientist who studies religion and has studied religion for a long time, I can't prove what I'm about to say. So you take it with a grain of salt, and I say it just like this to my students every semester. I do not think that you can infer anything about a person or a community's likelihood of engaging in violence by knowing whether or not they are religious or how religious they are. The only thing you know about a person, you're trying to predict, is this person likely to engage in intimate partner abuse? You want to ask a question that's going to help you predict the likelihood of them doing it? Don't ask if they're religious or not. It's not going to tell you anything about it. Don't ask what kind of religion they are. You're wondering what the crime rate or the rate of going to war or something like that is in a given community or a given nation. You want to have some basis for predicting it. Religiosity, religious participation in the community in question is not going to tell you anything useful.
Is anybody making that claim though?
I think a lot of people are making that claim. I think a lot of people are making that
Isn't
claim.
that the point of the series, is to kind of like, and the book, to kind of like dig into it, to understand the intricacies?
I think, well, I don't know about the series, but I think the book is absolutely making this claim. That Mormon people are more likely to be violent because they're Mormon.
Well,
And because Mormonism contains violence.
What's that?
I don't even know how anybody could make that claim because
Because you
the
don't,
evidence is clear that
Well, it's,
you don't have to support it. Because it seems intuitive. But I want to finish what I was going to say though, because this is an important sort of like implication. You have to flip this coin too, which is, in addition to having a lot of people in the world right now who's saying that religion causes a lot of bad stuff to happen, you also have a lot of people in the world saying the opposite. Not just that religion doesn't cause bad stuff, but that it causes good stuff. I am perfectly willing to extend my logic there too. I don't think being a religious person makes you more likely to be bad or good. And I don't think being a religious community makes you more likely to be bad or good. More likely to be warlike or peaceful. There are completely different factors, and you can mobilize a non-religious community to do good things and to do bad things just as easily as you can a religious one.
and I think we'll talk about some of the origins of religion another day, but one thing that has come up repeatedly in research, where we do have data that indicate this, is that religion is more closely tied with what's called prosociality, or it's tied with behaviors that support the cohesion of a social group.
Like language and kinship and...
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that it proliferates, that it perseveres. And I'm going to put religion in scare quotes because
We'll talk about that later. But
talk about that later. But this is another function of identity politics. It helps communities to stay together, to cooperate with each other. And sometimes, depending on what the institution wants people to aim their concern at, it can engender either cooperation or conflict with an outgroup. And one of the arguments that was made, in addition to just that religion is violent, monotheism is inherently violent.
Particularly violent.
Right.
Yeah, the non-monotheistic religions are less violent.
And so the books that talk about this, I think Sam Harris's, is it The End of Faith?
End of Faith is a good...
End of Faith is one of the most sustained attempts to say that religion poisons everything and is responsible for all this violence. And you see this all the time, kind of the Reddit atheists, that religion has caused, more death and more wars, but that's just not true. It's just kind of
But it seems so intuitive to so many people.
It seems so intuitive.
Just as intuitive, by the way, as saying that religion causes harmony and community and charity and stuff is to other people. It's totally intuitive. Like, well, of course, I shouldn't even have to defend that claim. All these religions are saying be nice and be charitable and be kind to each other. Of course, Christianity causes people to be Christian.
And while it can increase certain metrics of what we take to be good stuff, it can also increase metrics of what we take to be bad stuff.
Without being in the primary driver's seat on either of them.
And it depends on what the social group, what is pro-social for that group, because just a second, what might firm up boundaries, what might serve our boundary maintenance, might be conflict with another group, might be to put down another group, might be to cause harm to another group. In another circumstance, it might be to reach out to another group. It might help
to collaborate, to develop trade relations with them.
It depends on what leadership, what the group as a whole perceives to serve their interests as a group. Sometimes that's for good, sometimes that's for bad. So to say that religion either causes good or causes bad, either as a net or in the gross or whatever, is like saying language causes
Exactly.
good or causes bad.
I mean, what has been a more
It's-
exquisite tool in human history to mobilize people
Yeah.
to do really bad shit and also really great stuff than language? Like we are so much more effective at motivating and mobilizing people to do good and bad things because we have language to mobilize them with. And yet it would be absurd to say that language causes
well,
good behavior or
yeah,
bad behavior.
inspires good or bad behavior. I'm
Or
sorry,
inspires.
What were you gonna say? You forgot?
No, no, but
I'm
I
in
would
trouble?
like to have addressed it then.
Okay.
It's just, everything seems to me to be being explained away. And to me, I'd like to know, are there studies that say that definitively religion does have a better effect than it does a violent effect, like a more peaceful effect than a more violent effect?
No.
There's no studies.
No.
For one,
It's impossible to design a study like
Yeah.
that.
and there's
There
a
just couldn't even be one.
There's a great book that just came out that was edited by Russell McCutcheon and Aaron Hughes called What is Religion? And it's a collection of proposed descriptions of religion by religious studies scholars and then responses by other religious studies scholars. And one of the articles in there talks about how they look at a bunch of studies that have been conducted on the effects of religion and showed that all these studies deployed such different definitions of religion as to render the data completely useless, just because one study defined it in a way that included certain things and excluded other things. Another study designed it so to include those other things and exclude other. And it's because religion is not something that exists out there in the world. It's something that exists in our discourse. We create it by talking about it. And so as a result, it's not a force beyond our talking about it. And so it's what the communities and the groups and the leaders and the people say that acts as the force. And that's not something that you can draw a line around for any kind of study.
And I think it's really unhelpful to have these very big sweeping claims about religion itself or monotheism itself, because it's like that's the antithesis, like explaining away specific actual violence as simply the product of monotheism takes away any further explanation, any need to actually go and figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Right? It's like I don't know, in the 90s, I can't remember the years, but there were some Eastern European archives in the aftermath of the Cold War, some Eastern European archives that opened up. And there was an SS unit in World War II that had a ton of blood on its hands, and that had just kept shockingly immaculate records. And researchers went in and looked at these records. And you had these two scholars, one by the name of Daniel Goldhagen and one by the name of Christopher Browning, who go into these archives and they write books about the same unit, the same group of men. Daniel Goldhagen's book is called Hitler's Willing Executioners, and Browning's book is called Ordinary Men. They're looking at the same records. I highly recommend reading the second edition of Ordinary Men, because it's one in which he also, the books are published at roughly the same time, and draw very different conclusions. And most of Goldhagen's thesis revolves around the sort of like rhetorical power of Hitler. Right? That Hitler is captivating people with what he's saying and motivating people to go out and sort of brainwashing people. He's a puppet master with his violent anti-Semitism is just essentially causing people to do this. I mean, that's an oversimplification of Goldhagen's thing, but like he places an enormous amount of emphasis on this sort of like singularity of Hitler's charisma. and the effect that his propaganda was having on people, and they became his willing executioners. Goldhagen's book pays almost no attention to Hitler at all, and just describes the social dynamics among this group of men and how very, very ordinary social forces like peer pressure, like not wanting to lose your job or not wanting to face censure, or consequences for doing your job poorly or whatever. Entirely ordinary dynamics. Like it's so, the enactment of the Holocaust is so mundane because it's carried out by ordinary people just doing their jobs. And I mean, if there's a lesson from Goldhagen's book, it's don't have a Hitler. But there are other lessons that you can take from Browning's book that don't have anything to do with don't have a Hitler, right? So how do you figure out what the hell actually happened and how Mountain Meadows happened if the whole explanation for it is that Puppet Master Brigham Young made it happen? You learn nothing. We're supposed to watch this show and ask ourselves hard questions. And I think the show actually is capable of posing hard questions to us. We talked about some of these in past weeks, but like, what kinds of extremism are we very tolerant of? And what kinds of deviation from the norm are we aggressively intolerant of? Why are we tolerant of Lafferty and Bundy style violence, Lafferty and Bundy style anti-government activities, political extremism and radicalism, but like somebody, a feminist scholar says, let's talk more about Heavenly Mother. That's a question that is actually, even if it's ham-fisted, even if it's over the top, the delivery, even if they don't sound like Mormons, Dustin Lance Black is actually portraying that dynamic to us, and that's a dynamic that's real, even if we don't say Prophet Taylor. But these kinds of questions, what does it mean to live in a society where secular authority matters and have loyalty to ecclesiastical authority? What does it mean to want to, what are the consequences of rigorous boundary maintenance? Right? These are hard questions, and these are questions that are actually implicated in what happened. Okay? But I guess the alternative is just don't have a Joseph Smith or a Brigham Young, and then you won't be a violent people. Like if the explanation is just, well, okay, don't be monotheists. Monotheism made you do it. Like the more sweeping and reductive the explanation, the less possible it is for us to actually address questions that we do in fact need to address. What kinds of spousal violence did Mormons tolerate? What kinds of violence from husbands toward wives did Mormons look the other way? Right? To me, still, the most important scene so far, Ammon trying to beat the shit out of Dan. Ron comes up, starts punching Ammon. Ward members drive by. Everything okay? Sure. They keep going. That is orders of magnitude more relevant than a pamphlet.
And I think there's a scene in the last episode, the one that just aired, where Pyrie is calling out LeConte on his recollection of what happened, and you see the flashback to what he actually saw, which is Ron drag her outside, put her in the car, and then smack her.
Which are strong indicators of abuse and then actual abuse.
And then what he said was, I just thought that was a domestic. That's something that was tolerated. He decided not to make a big deal out of that because that was between husband and wife. That was not his problem.
And his tolerance of that, seeing that behavior and not talking to Ron Bishop about it, and not going to the police about it. Just saying it was their business and I let it be their business. That explains infinitely more what happened to Brenda than some mysterious phone call from the prophet's office telling people to circle their wagons or whatever. Which one of the things I struggled with this episode was the moment of bravery, right? Like he blamed it on fundamentalists, and that constitutes they're portraying it as if like Mormons know, and we do in fact know, and we are very sensitive about, and we have been for a long time, outsiders perceiving sort of the lack of distinction between us and polygamous fundamentalists, right?
It doesn't help that we still have 132 as canonized.
No,
scripture.
no, it doesn't. But the point is that would lead to the opposite effect in this case, to absolutely wanting to foreground that this was fundamentalist. Because this is a big problem we have as Mormons. In reality, there are blurry lines between us and fundamentalists, different kinds of fundamentalists, Warren Jeffs type fundamentalists, Lafferty type fundamentalists, Bundy type fundamentalists, different kind of extreme groups. There aren't very clear lines actually, okay? But we'll throw them under the bus anytime we can. Because if you could show that something that a member of the Mormon community did, oh, well, he was a fundamentalist, you sweep it under the rug. You can dismiss it. You don't have to address it at all. Like that would be the clean, but like the idea that like when they found out they were fundamentalists, that made them less likely to disclose it, that was something they wanted to protect. It would have absolutely, and I have no doubt that they actually did.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like Detective Pyrie's wife, when he like goes up and says that, like he's like, I wouldn't rule out Mormon fundamentalists. She like has like a visceral reaction. Yeah. I'm like, that's not realistic because we're way too good at like internally thrusting those people out and throwing them under the bus to have that sort of reaction. Well, as soon as
what would have happened is he would have said that, and all that you would have done like a quick shot of 20 different Mormon families sitting in their homes going,
yeah, they would be like, yeah, okay, that tracks.
It's not us. It's the fundies. It's not us. And instead he's like even Detective Taub is like, I'm so proud of you.
Yeah.
But like the idea of simultaneously wanting to protect fundamentalists from exposure because you think that people are going to, like, we've been throwing fundamentalists under the bus for a century, like participating in the public exposure of their crimes and helping the government prosecute them. Like we have a long history of doing this. And that, to me, that also kind of dovetails with the whole, like, I still don't get why they're trying to make these guys seem like they were the Kennedys, like they're the Huntsmans or something. they are just.
No.
And can somebody clarify?
Renamed them Romneys.
And one thing I didn't understand, there are two things about this show so far that have just baffle me. Who cares about French fries? Why was that such a big deal? Has anybody found like an actual explanation? Because I was like, is he like, that's unhealthy, and like nobody can see me eating a couple of French fries, or were they trying to say something more sinister? Like do you have an answer?
No, I was just saying it needed to be a Coke or a Pepsi.
Oh.
That made total sense.
And the other thing is.
No, I think he had his hand up.
Yeah, I was up there. I saw the couch when I used the restroom. Decided to.
You're good.
I read one explanation of the French fry thing as it could have been Sunday, and therefore eating McDonald's would be breaking the Sabbath. Which there's no framework in the show to indicate that.
Does it work?
Among plenty of other things that the show doesn't give you any framework.
We could track down what day that happened.
I mean, again, like I think you could plausibly justify it by saying that like Mormons are like, conscious of not putting bad things in their body or something, which is true. That's a framework we think of for the word of wisdom, but it's certainly not true of junk food or sugar or.
That's a crumble.
Second thing is why everybody was treating the stake president like a celebrity when he came into the office. Like, I had to rewind and check the name. Like, was this somebody we're supposed to know? I think it was Ballard, but I was like, is this,
Yeah, they gave
was it related to,
He says President Ballard's son, what an honor. Something
oh,
like
did
that.
he say President Ballard's son?
Which
Okay, I
still
wondered about that.
Doesn't orient the non-Mormon viewer at all,
Yeah,
and makes the Mormon viewer
because
differently confused.
what they're going to think is, are stake presidents really this big a deal? That, like, the cops are like,
Well,
And-
it kind of felt like it was proposing that, even outside
Yeah,
his
yeah.
relationship to Elder Ballard. Like, it narratively did kind
Oh,
of.
it did. It
and
absolutely
Maybe
did.
that's the point.
I mean, because the whole
Narrative
idea
was the power
that,
of
yeah,
the
like
church,
that a stake president would walk into a police station and be like, these boys are going with me. and that like he would feel pressure to do it rather than laugh in his face. I mean, he probably wouldn't laugh in his face. He'd probably be like very polite and be like, no, they need to stay in custody, I'm afraid. You know, this is the law, and you know that like he'd be dismissive. He wouldn't feel any like he was being challenged or something. You
Well,
know.
I feel like it could have been a commentary on like Mormon nepotism, because that is an interesting topic that you could have addressed, but it wasn't.
It's a very interesting topic,
Yeah.
right? But again, instead of it being about that, it goes into this sort of like sinister priesthood trying to protect the Laffertys,
Yeah.
who are already excommunicated.
But again, like, if it happened, I have no idea if that happened or any interaction like that occurred. But if it did, I almost feel like it would be in the spirit of authenticity and still be able to achieve the same effect
Uh-huh.
to swap a stake president for a 70 or something.
Yeah.
Because the higher up this person is, the more at least believable that they would have this sort of celebrity influence on the group. And you can still achieve your narrative function that you're trying to accomplish.
Do you think that the intention of that was to show that people, even lower down in the church, leaders have much more power than in other religious groups?
I think that's probably part of the intention of it, and I also just think it has dramatic intention. Like it just, again, like I'm trying to picture a non-Mormon context for this, or you know, Reverend Billy Lee Tuttle or whatever, and like it rings solid for me. Like it rings like, oh, that's a nice little, you know. I mean, there was literally scenes like that in True Detective, right? where like there's a religious functionary coming in trying to push the investigation in a different direction. The chief is feeling really torn between his detectives and this religious figure, and trying to sort of like thread a needle on that.
And that arguably can and does happen. I mean, in the case of Mark Hoffman, that happened. There was some damage control, kind of like, how much do we want this to be, you know, out in the open, and we are going to meddle.
But certainly not go get these
Yes.
boys who are being questioned for murder from jail and just invoke your authority as a stake president to do it.
Right.
You know.
I would say that there is a certain element that I haven't really observed in other religions, but when there's a Mormon that commits a crime, they often mention the fact that they're Mormon. Like, I grew up in a family where my dad was a convert to the church. My grandma was very anti, and she would often have these conversations with us, like, about Mark Hoffman or something, and she would say, oh, and he was a deacon, like he was an ordained deacon, and then, you know, just like completely outlandish, like it was this huge thing that this man was a deacon or a priest.
Yeah.
You know, but I have noticed that the religious connection is often mentioned, but you don't really see that so often when they're like Presbyterian or.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, like, you know, Mormon authority is one of the most interesting things about Mormonism, and a source of a lot of the most frustrating things about Mormonism, toxic things about Mormonism. But, you know, like, again, you can actually produce something that sort of like ethnographically exfoliates all of the interesting layers of the onion of how Mormons enact authority in the familial and ecclesiastical and central level and stuff like that. Or you can just make them look like Reverend Billy Lee Tuttle and act like a stock character who's an entitled religious authority coming in to try to interfere with an investigation.
and then threatening your salvation.
Yeah.
And then what I thought was even more ludicrous was it his wife, the woman who confronted him,
I couldn't tell if she was his
outside,
wife or if she was just like a friend. Because she said,
Somehow
"I've been
colluding.
praying with
Yeah.
the stake president."
and then confronts Kyrie out front and basically like demands that he baptize his daughters, and that was just so heavy-handed. The second you talk about taking a step back or pausing on something as significant as baptizing your children,
Yeah,
that
I know that.
the leadership is going to come down hard on you.
I know that she wasn't his wife because she was the one who went looking for
His mother.
Kyrie's mom. Yeah, and they signed a different name. So.
Oh yeah,
it wasn't.
that's true. Yeah.
So she's just some random.
And listen,
She's certainly
Ken-
a stock character.
She and in her own way, she's a stock Mormon character. It's just she's doing it wrong. But like, can Mormons be like passive aggressive busybodies? Yeah, but they're not passive aggressive busybodies about you baptizing your kids. They are about other shit. You know what I mean?
My wife me, she's like, yeah, I know that person.
Yeah.
I've met her several times.
You've met her, but you've never seen her giving people a hard time because they're thinking about postponing their kid's baptism by a month.
We had a question on the
Well,
stage.
just on these scenes with the stake president and authority, I'm wondering if I was alone in being like, pick a team here, y'all, because, earlier in the episode, it's like, you did business with fundamentalists. You could be excommunicated for that. And then later in the show, the stake president is trying to get the fundamentalist-leaning members out of the thing
And protect them, yeah.
Kyrie with excommunication if he doesn't assist it. Like, not just excommunication, but kind of outer darkness. Was anybody else like experiencing cognitive dissonance, shall we say, with the two frameworks of the thing? And then, earlier you were talking about just the kind of confirmation bias. I'm noticing a lot of confirmation bias cutting both ways on this.
Oh yeah.
I definitely see the LDS ones being like, looking for fault to therefore discredit the whole thing.
Yeah, just
But
to
I see a lot of ex-Mormons
dismiss it.
ignoring all the problems, more objective flaws with the drama and the narrative.
Well,
Because
ignoring is, I actually think, the defensible move here.
Yeah.
Ignoring the problems is okay. The weird thing I'm seeing is people pretending they're not problems.
Yeah.
Saying like, no, Mormons do talk like that.
Right.
No, like they do give each other crap for not baptizing their girls right when they turn 8 or whatever they do.
And there are weird ways that like Mormonism interacts with political power and the justice system here in the state. Not as strange and explicit as it was in that case, but like it's there.
It's there.
Don't I know?
And that's a fair question.
I had hoped that that the series would provide more of an opportunity to discuss some of the more problematic historical elements, but I have found that a lot of the, like you said, the true believing members, completely dismiss it.
It's
Like, a lot of
ruining
people
that opportunity actually, rather than
Right.
presenting it.
Like they said, I'm not even gonna watch it. I saw the first episode, and I can tell this person has an axe to grind. So, because that is not what I.
And one of the things that I struggle with here is that you don't have to make anything up.
Right.
Like there's actually a ton of really like the incredibly accurate, like Rick Turley's description of Mountain Meadows is so much more devastating than John Krakauer's. Because it's just like, because he's not trying to sensationalize any of it. He's just describing it. And it's just like gutting. But you're reading Krakauer, you read Will Bagley, you read Sally Denton, and you can tell they're like trying to make it seem like you can see the rhetorical purpose there, right? And that actually disempowers it.
Yeah.
I especially because again, like Mormons, faithful, devout Mormons cannot dismiss Rick Turley's book, right? You can just tell the truth, and there's plenty of fodder there for like, oh, these are dark parts of our past. You can just tell the truth about it. Again, you can just read D&C 132. There's, not like start to finish, but like there are a number of points in D&C 132 that are as damning as anything you could make up.
On that, I don't mean to hijack or.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
And maybe I missed this because I was late. sold all my service at food before. Anyway, on the 132 scene, my problem with it, did anybody else have problems with this? I didn't mind that they were incorporating actual text. I think it was appropriate.
Mhm.
To incorporate it as an on-the-spot revelation,
Yeah.
where it was just the two of them, again, and it's not like, oh, I'm gonna discredit this whole show because it does something against, but it's the ratio, the manner in which they get these things wrong versus what they get right that is a constant hurdle for me as I watch. But the weirdest thing about it is that she does burn the manuscript at the end, and it's like, well, why is there a manuscript already there if it's dramatically presented as him just getting the revelation live? It made no sense to me. And again, the thing of like, okay, you have to orient the non-Mormon viewer. I'm like, yeah, but they didn't do that. Like, unless you're a Mormon who knows the sticking point about 132, that scene is gonna
It's going to be
be over
confusing.
your head. And if you do know it, you're gonna be so incensed about everything they get wrong about it. It's just very strange.
I mean, I have to also say here as a disclaimer that most of what my approach to sort of like defending choices about like ethnographic specificity and portrayal of modern Mormons and sort of weighing that against like legibility to outsiders, none of that's a defense of a lot of the shit they're pulling on the historical stuff.
Okay, cool.
It's
I
just
wasn't accusing you of that.
no. I didn't think you were, but I just want to make clear, like I don't think it's accomplishing the same purpose. I don't think it's working the same way, and I think the only effect that it's having is ensuring that actual Mormons will not care one bit about this show and what it says, and not take anything that it has to say seriously, which is too bad.
Yeah.
So my brother's good friend actually works in the history department of the church, and I had heard that they had a point-by-point response to all of the historical elements as they were presented in Krakow's book.
Yeah.
And they shelved the whole thing after seeing the first 2 episodes because they thought that
It wasn't
nobody's gonna take
necessary.
it seriously.
It wasn't, no, it's way too melodramatic. It doesn't signal like people. I just have a hard time even imagining outsiders thinking that it's an accurate portrayal because it's just so heavy-handed, you know. And just really weird choices. Like again, I'm assuming that we're moving in the direction of also just like misrepresenting the assassination of the Smith brothers as something Brigham Young was involved in order to get them out of the way and enact his more violent vision that he's been wanting to enact all along.
I think just to that point, and even outside of the non-Mormon context, but as we've talked about the fact that Krakauer or Black clearly have a thesis, I struggle a little bit with the idea of trying to get at truth, present truth. And I understand there's some narrative, creative choices you have to make to, artistic liberties. But to get at truth by telling a lie, I think that Latter-day Saint cinema proper, like within our culture, does this too.
Oh yeah,
a lot
for sure.
And
like faith promoting stuff. This is one of the like. I mean, it's a comeback I hear quite a bit from like more critical of the church viewers who are saying like, oh, suddenly you care about historical accuracy now.
Right. But it's interesting that it's like, well, it's making the same, it's committing the same error. It's like if you're trying to get, balance, obviously appealing to a mass audience, but if you're trying to get Mormons to reflect and internalize on this stuff, you got to get most of the history right. You can't present this absurd kind of conspiracy theory and be like, whoa, but also think about violence, like it's too much. I feel like it disqualifies the thesis a little bit.
Go ahead.
I know that they wanted to focus somewhat on accuracy, but the notion that this is about truth, I think is just incorrect. I think that this is just to get you to think, and where I think this is going is more about polarity and not about the show seems like it's presenting Mormonism doesn't make people less violent. To me, that's what I'm getting, or that's what I'm choosing to get. I'm just seeing it as juxtaposition, antithesis, of these two ideas, because we're talking about non-religious people persecuting Mormons and Mormons persecuting non-religious people. just that juxtaposition makes me think like we're just talking about good old fashioned like, yeah.
Well, we'll see. We got a couple of, I'm assuming, heavy episodes coming up. So we're gonna do another one next week on episode 5. We're not gonna be here on Memorial Day, and then back here on, I think it's the 6th of June. Is that the first Monday in June? I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's right after MHA. So we'll know about dating Fanny Alger when we hit that one. But we'll talk about episodes 6 and 7 that
And
day.
I hope there are no more big plot twists, because I don't know if I can take that. Detective Pyrie running from one room to another. That was quite a bit.
I do still really like the acting. The material that they're given to work with is there are things there, but I think it's a hell of an acted show for at least most of the characters.
For some reason, I am temporarily blanking on the actor who plays Ron.
No, that's Sam Worthington.
Worthington, right? Yeah, I like him as an actor, and I don't think he's gotten to really spread his wings in this show yet. So I'm hoping that.
No, neither is Captain America. What's his name? Dan.
I think
White Russell.
What's
I
that?
thought
Yeah,
Ford
White
was the
Russell.
strongest, at least.
Yeah.
Did anyone watch the cliffhanger at the end twice? I did, because I was trying to figure out the significance of it. You have the man with the long hair and the beard,
Oh, yeah.
that was weird.
and then like Big O and Bishop
And he vanishes.
was, yeah, it was such a bizarre way to end the show. Like even, I know it was supposed to be a cliffhanger from the music that was playing, cue creepy music, that
Yeah.
Oh, what was the cliffhanger?
the guy with the long hair and the beard leads him to the bishop who's fly fishing, and I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, that's supposed to be like super.
Well, I think for folks who don't know the story, maybe they're expecting bodies for them to have been murdered as well, and so it's kind of a release. Oh, they're okay. But yeah, that was also weird. And the cop that they had was.
We'll get a weird, ethnically ambiguous guy with a knife, and he'll just be like your guide, and he'll walk 30 feet ahead of you the whole time and take you where you need to
The
go.
only guy so far in the show that had a beard that I saw.
And lead you 30 feet to the river.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought he was looking for a lake. He took him to a river. But,
He asked about a lake.
yeah. He said, "You're lost." And then, yeah, that was. No, the end of episode 2. That was the one where Detective Tava looks in the window and the barrel of the gun comes out. That was much better.
That was more effective
than this one. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for being here, guys. We're gonna wrap things up.
Alrighty.
Spanish is good.
Oh, thank you.
I need to do a quick poll. Who's here because you saw this from an email?
Yeah, what we're trying to figure out
Yeah.
what
What's
got you guys
working?
here.
Okay, no
Did you see it
email.
on- did you see it in an email announcement? Did you see a?